The wind howled through the mountain pass like the cries of the damned, carrying with it the scent of snow and something far more ominous. Laura Smith pressed herself against the rough bark of a towering pine, her breath coming in sharp, visible puffs as she watched the figures moving through the trees below. Three men, their faces hard as the granite peaks surrounding them, methodically searched the forest floor for any sign of her passage. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she recognized the leader. Marcus Thornfield, the man who had destroyed everything she held dear, who had taken her husband's life and burned their homestead to ash. The man who now hunted her through these unforgiving mountains with the persistence of a wolf tracking wounded prey. His voice carried on the bitter air, cold and calculating as he directed his companions to spread out, to cover more ground. Laura's fingers trembled as she clutched the small bundle pressed against her chest. Inside the rough cloth lay the last remnants of her former life, a few precious coins and a letter that could expose Thornfield's crimes to the territorial authorities. If she could reach the settlement beyond the mountain pass, if she could survive long enough to tell her story, justice might finally be served. But with each passing hour, that possibility seemed as distant as the stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky above. The sound of breaking branches made her freeze. One of Thornfield's men was climbing toward her position, his boots crunching through the thin layer of snow that had begun to fall. Laura closed her eyes and pressed harder against the tree, willing herself to become invisible, to disappear into the wilderness that had become both her sanctuary and her prison. That was when she heard it, a low whistle, barely audible above the wind, coming from somewhere deeper in the forest. The sound seemed to confuse Thornfield's man, who paused in his ascent and turned his head toward the source. Another whistle answered the first, this one from a different direction entirely. The searcher's confidence wavered, and Laura saw him reach for the rifle slung across his shoulder. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. The whistles continued, creating an eerie symphony that seemed to surround the three hunters. Laura watched as uncertainty crept into their movements. They had come to these mountains expecting to find a frightened woman alone and defenseless, not whatever presence now seemed to be watching them from the shadows. Thornfield barked an order, his voice sharp with frustration, and his men began to retreat toward lower ground. As their footsteps faded into the distance, Laura remained motionless against the tree, afraid to trust what seemed like deliverance. The forest fell silent except for the whisper of wind through the branches and the soft patter of snowflakes on frozen ground. She waited, counting her heartbeats, until a new sound reached her ears. Footsteps, but these were different. Careful, deliberate, belonging to someone who knew these mountains intimately. A shadow detached itself from the darkness between the trees. Tall and broad-shouldered, moving with the fluid grace of a predator, the figure approached her hiding place with an assurance that spoke of years spent in these wild places. Laura's breath caught in her throat as moonlight revealed the face of her unexpected rescuer. Weather-beaten features, eyes the color of storm clouds, and a beard that spoke of months spent far from civilization. This was no ordinary mountain man, but someone who had made these peaks his domain. 3 months earlier, Laura Smith had stood in the doorway of her modest cabin, watching her husband Thomas prepare for what would be his final journey to town. The morning sun painted the valley in shades of gold and amber, and the air carried the promise of an early spring. She had no way of knowing that by evening, her world would be reduced to ashes and grief. Thomas had been a good man, perhaps too good for the harsh realities of frontier life. He had believed in justice, in the power of truth to triumph over corruption. When he discovered that Marcus Thornfield had been systematically cheating homesteaders out of their land claims, falsifying documents and bribing territorial officials, Thomas felt compelled to act. He gathered evidence, documented the crimes, and prepared to present his findings to the territorial governor. Laura had begged him to be careful, to consider the danger of challenging a man with Thornfield's wealth and connections. But Thomas had been resolute. He could not stand by and watch innocent families lose everything they had worked for while Thornfield grew rich from their suffering. He kissed Laura goodbye that morning, promising to return within a week with news that justice would finally be served. The week passed without word, then 2 weeks. When the third week arrived with no sign of Thomas, Laura knew in her heart that something terrible had happened. She rode to town herself, ignoring the worried protests of her neighbors, determined to learn her husband's fate. What she found there chilled her to the bone. Thomas had never reached the territorial capital. His horse had been found wandering riderless along the mountain trail, his saddlebags missing, his fate officially recorded as an unfortunate encounter with bandits. But Laura knew better. She saw the satisfaction in Thornfield's eyes when he offered his condolences, heard the subtle threat beneath his words of sympathy. The evidence Thomas had gathered was gone, but Laura had kept copies hidden in their cabin. For a brief moment, she considered taking up her husband's cause, continuing his fight for justice. That moment of hope died when she returned home to find her cabin in flames. Everything she owned reduced to smoking ruins. Standing in the glow of the fire, watching her life disappear into the night sky, was Marcus Thornfield himself. He had not expected to find her there, had assumed she was still in town. The surprise in his eyes quickly gave way to cold calculation as he realized the problem she represented. Laura had turned and run into the forest, knowing that her life now hung by the thinnest of threads. Behind her, she heard Thornfield shouting orders to his men, organizing the hunt that would drive her higher and higher into the mountains. For 3 months, she had lived like a ghost among the peaks, surviving on whatever she could forage or trap, always moving, never daring to stay in one place for more than a few days. The mountain winter had been brutal, testing her endurance and will to survive. More than once, she had considered simply giving up, allowing the cold or hunger to claim her rather than continuing this desperate flight. But something deep within her refused to surrender. Perhaps it was the memory of Thomas and his belief in justice. Perhaps it was simple stubbornness, a refusal to let Thornfield's evil triumph completely. Whatever the source of her strength, it had carried her through the darkest months of her life and brought her to this moment, standing in the snow-covered forest, face to face with a stranger who might be her salvation or her doom. The mountain man studied her with eyes that seemed to see everything. He took in her ragged clothing, her hollow cheeks, the desperate wariness in her posture. When he spoke, his voice was low and rough, like gravel tumbling down a mountainside. It was not a question, and Laura saw no point in denying it. She nodded, her hand instinctively moving to the bundle containing the evidence that had cost her husband his life. The man's gaze followed the movement, and she saw understanding flicker in his storm-gray eyes. "Name's Daniel Hall," he said simply. "These are my mountains. Have been for nigh on 15 years. Laura found her voice, though it came out as little more than a whisper. "Laura Smith. My husband was Thomas Smith." Recognition dawned in Daniel's expression. "Tarbalactorino," Laura said, the word falling between them like a swing into still water. "Kutamba." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving past her to scan the forest for any sign of pursuit. When he looked back at her, something had changed in his expression. There was a hardness there that spoke of old anger, old pain. He said finally, the cabin was hidden so well that Laura would have walked past it without noticing if Daniel had not led her directly to the entrance. Built into the side of a granite cliff and camouflaged with carefully arranged branches and stones, it looked like nothing more than a natural outcropping of rock. Only when Daniel moved aside a section of what appeared to be solid stone did the doorway become visible. Inside, the cabin was larger than its concealed entrance suggested. The main room was carved partially into the living rock, with walls of fitted stone and timber that spoke of years of careful construction. A fire crackled in a stone hearth, smoke disappearing through a hidden chimney that vented among the natural rock formations above. The warmth hit Laura like a physical blow, and she realized how cold she had become during her months of exposure to the mountain winter. Daniel gestured toward a chair near the fire, one of several pieces of furniture that showed the skilled craftsmanship of someone who had time and patience to create beauty, even in this remote place. Laura sank into the chair gratefully, feeling the heat begin to penetrate her chilled bones. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to truly relax, to believe that she might be safe. "Hold on," Daniel said as he moved about the cabin with economical efficiency, gathering supplies. Quote 10. Laura watched him prepare food, simple fare, but more than she had eaten in weeks. Quote 11. Quote 1. Daniel observed, setting a bowl of stew before her. Quote 13. The stew was rich and warming, filled with meat and vegetables that Laura had almost forgotten existed. She ate slowly, savoring each bite while Daniel settled into the chair across from her. In the firelight, his weathered features seemed less harsh, though the intensity in his eyes remained unchanged. Quote 14, he said quietly. Laura found herself speaking of Thomas, of the man he had been, and the dreams they had shared. She told Daniel about their small homestead, about Thomas's work as a surveyor that had brought him into contact with Thornfield's fraudulent land schemes. She described the evidence Thomas had gathered, the meticulous documentation of forged documents and bribed officials. She said, staring into the fire. Daniel asked, quote 18. Laura was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. To 19. Daniel nodded slowly. Quote 20. Something in his tone made Laura look at him more closely. Quote 1. Quote 20. Daniel said, his voice growing distant. Quote Austin. Daniel's hands tightened on the arms of his chair as he continued. Lost everything. My land, my stock, my... He paused, pain flickering across his features. My wife, she died that winter, after Thornfield's men burned us out. Couldn't get her to the doctor in time. Couldn't keep her warm enough in the shelter we found. Laura felt her heart constrict with sympathy and understanding. I'm sorry. Been 15 years, Daniel said simply. Long time to carry anger. But some things don't fade. Some debts don't get forgiven. They sat in comfortable salons for a while. Two people who had lost everything to the same man's greed. Outside, the wind continued to howl through the mountain passes, but inside the hidden cabin, warmth and safety created a small pocket of peace in a hostile world. Quote 29. Daniel asked eventually. Laura reached for the bundle she had carried so carefully through the mountains. Quote 30. She unwrapped the documents carefully, revealing pages of evidence that detailed Thornfield's crimes with devastating clarity. Property deeds with forged signatures, correspondence between Thornfield and corrupt officials, financial records showing payments made to ensure favorable rulings. It was everything Thomas had died trying to expose. Daniel examined the papers with growing interest. This would hang him if it reached the right people. That's what I've been trying to do, Laura said. Get to the territorial capital, present this to the governor, but Thornfield's been hunting me, and winter made travel impossible. Spring's coming, Daniel observed. Passes will be clear in another month or two, but Thornfield won't give up. He'll keep hunting until he finds you. Laura nodded, the weight of her situation settling over her again. I know, but what choice do I have? I can't hide in these mountains forever. Daniel was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire as if seeing something in the flames that she could not. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a new resolve. Maybe you don't have to run anymore. Maybe it's time to make Thornfield do the running. The next morning brought clear skies and the kind of crystalline air that made the mountain peaks seem close enough to touch. Laura woke in a real bed for the first time in months, warm beneath thick blankets that smelled of pine and wood smoke. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine that the nightmare of the past months had been just that, a dream from which she had finally awakened. But reality reasserted itself quickly enough. The bundle of evidence lay on the table where she had left it, and through the cabin's single window, she could see Daniel moving about outside, checking snares and examining the forest for signs of intrusion. Even in this hidden sanctuary, vigilance was the price of survival. Daniel returned as she was preparing breakfast, bringing with him fresh rabbit meat and news that made her blood run cold. Quote 38, he reported. Quote 38, Laura felt her heart sink. Quote 41, quote 1, Daniel agreed. Quote 40, quote version, Laura looked at him with surprise. To quote Barren, Daniel's expression hardened. Thornfield made it my fight 15 years ago. I've been waiting for a chance to balance the scales. Maybe that chance just walked into my mountains. Over the following days, Daniel shared with Laura the knowledge he had accumulated during his years in the wilderness. He taught her to read the subtle signs that revealed the presence of other humans in the forest, to move through the underbrush without leaving tracks, to use the terrain itself as both weapon and shield. More importantly, he shared his intimate knowledge of the mountain geography, the hidden passes and forgotten trails that only someone who had lived here for years would know. Thornfield thinks he has you trapped, Daniel explained as they studied a crude map he had drawn. He's watching the main roads, the obvious escape paths. But these mountains have secrets, ways through that most folks never discover. Laura traced the route Daniel had marked, a winding path that led through some of the most treacherous terrain in the region. It would be dangerous. Everything worth doing is dangerous, Daniel replied. Question is whether you're willing to take the risk. As they planned, Laura found herself studying her unlikely ally with growing curiosity. Daniel Hall was unlike any man she had ever known. Where Thomas had been gentle and scholarly, Daniel was hard and practical. Where her husband had believed in the power of words and laws, Daniel trusted only in action and results. Yet beneath his gruff exterior, she sensed a depth of character that reminded her why she had fallen in love with Thomas in the first place. Both men shared an unshakable moral core, a refusal to compromise with evil funding when the cost was everything they held dear. The difference was that Daniel had been forged by loss and hardship into something harder, more dangerous. He was what Thomas might have become if he had survived Thornfield's first attack. Quote 51. Laura asked one evening as they sat by the fire, the day's planning complete. Daniel was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than usual, touched with a vulnerability he rarely allowed to show. My wife's name was Catherine, he said. She was like you in some ways. Strong, determined, wouldn't back down from what she believed was right. When Thornfield's men came for our place, she wanted to fight. I made her run instead, told her it wasn't worth dying for. He paused, staring into the flames. She died anyway. Died cold and sick in a cave not much different from this one, while I held her hand and promised everything would be all right. Last thing she said was that someone had to stop men like Thornfield, that if good people didn't fight back, evil would just keep spreading. Laura felt tears prick her eyes. She sounds like she was a remarkable woman. She was, Daniel said simply. And she was right. I should have fought then. Should have made Thornfield pay for what he did. Instead, I ran to these mountains and hid like a wounded animal. Been hiding ever since. You're not hiding now, Laura pointed out. Daniel met her eyes across the fire. No, I'm not. Maybe it's time I honored Catherine's memory the way she deserved. The conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. Where before they had been allies of convenience, united by shared enemies and circumstances. Now they became true partners. Laura saw past Daniel's rough exterior to the man beneath. Wounded but not broken, capable of great tenderness despite the hardness life had forced upon him. For his part, Daniel seemed to find in Laura something he had thought lost forever. Her courage in the face of overwhelming odds, her refusal to surrender even when everything seemed hopeless, reminded him of the woman he had loved and lost. But Laura was her own person, with her own strength and her own fire. She was not a replacement for Catherine, but perhaps she was something even more precious. A second chance. The attack came at dawn on the fourth day of Laura's stay in the hidden cabin. Daniel's early warning system, a network of carefully placed tripwires and noisemakers, gave them perhaps 10 minutes' notice before Thornfield's men reached the concealed entrance. It was enough time to gather essential supplies and activate the escape plan they had rehearsed, but hoped never to use. They found us, Daniel said grimly as he shouldered his pack. Don't know how, but they're coming up the cliff face. Laura grabbed the precious bundle of evidence and her own meager possessions. How many? 6, maybe 8, more than we can fight. Daniel moved to a section of the cabin's rear wall that looked like solid stone, but proved to be another concealed entrance. Quote 64. The escape route was a testament to Daniel's years of careful preparation. The mine shaft connected to a natural cave system that wound deep into the mountain, emerging eventually at a hidden exit nearly 1,000 feet above the cabin. It was a treacherous climb made more dangerous by the need for absolute silence, but it offered their only chance of avoiding Thornfield's trap. They moved through the darkness with the careful precision of people whose lives depended on every step. Daniel led the way, his knowledge of the cave system allowing him to navigate by touch and memory. Behind him, Laura followed with the trust that came from days of observing his competence and dedication to her safety. The sound of voices echoed from below as Thornfield's men discovered the cabin. Laura heard the crash of furniture being overturned, the frustrated curses of men who had expected to find their quarry and instead found only an empty room. The sounds grew fainter as they climbed higher, but the knowledge that pursuit would follow drove them onward. They emerged from the cave system into the gray light of early morning, high on a ridge that offered a commanding view of the valley below. Laura could see the smoke rising from Daniel's cabin, now burning like her own home had burned months before. The sight filled her with a cold fury that surprised her with its intensity. Coach 65, she said, watching the flames consume years of careful construction. Daniel's expression was grim but unsurprised. Knew it might come to that. Place was just wood and stone anyway. What mattered was getting you out safe. They began the difficult descent toward the high pass, following trails that existed more in Daniel's memory than in any visible reality. The route he had chosen would take them through some of the most challenging terrain in the mountains, but it would also lead them around Thornfield's patrols and toward the territorial capital. As they traveled, Laura found herself thinking about the man beside her. Daniel Hall had given up everything for her cause, had sacrificed his sanctuary and his peaceful existence to help her seek justice for Thomas. She began to understand that this was about more than revenge or even justice. For Daniel, helping her was a form of redemption, a chance to finally fight the battle he should have fought 15 years ago. "You don't have to come with me all the way," she said during a brief rest. "Once we're clear of Thornfield's men, I can make it to the capital on my own." Daniel looked at her with something that might have been amusement. "You planning to walk into the territorial governor's office, looking like a wild woman and expect him to believe your story?" Laura glanced down at her ragged clothing and dirt-stained hands. She had grown so accustomed to her appearance that she had forgotten how she must look to civilized eyes. "I have the evidence. Evidence that could be forged, according to Thornfield's lawyers. You need more than papers, Laura. You need credibility, witnesses, people who can vouch for your character and your husband's." The truth of his words was undeniable, but it raised questions Laura was not sure she was ready to face. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that maybe there's another way to handle this, a way that doesn't depend on the same corrupt system that failed your husband." They resumed their journey as Daniel explained his thinking. Thornfield's power came from his wealth and his connections, but it also depended on his reputation as a respectable businessman. If that reputation could be destroyed, if his crimes could be exposed in a way that made denial impossible, then justice might be achieved without relying on officials who could be bought or intimidated, Laura said. Daniel replied. For 76, Laura was quiet for a long time, considering the implications of what Daniel was suggesting. Part of her recoiled from the idea of abandoning the legal system entirely, of taking justice into their own hands. That part sounded like Thomas, still believing in the power of law and order despite everything that had happened. But another part of her, a part that had grown stronger during her months in the wilderness, recognized the truth in Daniel's words. The system had failed Thomas, had failed Daniel and Catherine, had failed countless other victims of men like Thornfield. Perhaps it was time to try a different approach. The high pass was a narrow corridor between towering peaks, a place where the wind never stopped blowing and the air was thin enough to make every breath an effort. Laura and Daniel made their way through this desolate landscape with the persistence of people who understood that stopping meant death. Behind them, somewhere in the maze of canyons and ridges, Thornfield's men continued their pursuit. They had been traveling for 2 days since the attack on the cabin, living on the supplies Daniel had managed to grab during their hasty escape. The food was running low, and both of them were feeling the effects of the high altitude and constant exertion. But they were alive, and they were free. And for now, that was enough. Quote 77, Daniel said, pointing toward a distant smudge of smoke rising from the valley below. Quote 78. Millfield was a small mining town, one of dozens that had sprung up in the territory as prospectors searched for gold and silver in the mountain streams. Laura had never been there, but Thomas had mentioned it in his letters. Some of the homesteaders he had surveyed for lived in the area, people who might remember him and be willing to testify about Thornfield's fraudulent practices. The descent from the pass was treacherous, requiring them to rope down cliff faces and navigate loose scree that threatened to give way with every step. But Daniel moved with the confidence of someone who had traveled these routes before, and his sure guidance brought them safely to the valley floor as the sun was setting. Millfield was larger than Laura had expected, a collection of wooden buildings clustered around a main street that buzzed with activity even at this late hour. Miners coming off shift filled the saloons, while supply wagons rumbled through the muddy streets carrying goods to and from the various claims scattered throughout the surrounding hills. "We need to be careful," Daniel warned as they approached the town's outskirts. Quote at him. They entered Millfield separately, Daniel heading for the livery stable while Laura made her way to the general store. She needed to replace her worn-out clothing with something that would allow her to blend in with civilized society, and she needed information about which locals might be sympathetic to her cause. The store owner, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and calloused hands, took one look at Laura's condition and immediately offered assistance. "You look like you've had a hard time of it, dear. Come, let's find you something proper to wear." As Laura changed into a simple but clean dress, she found herself opening up to the woman, whose name was Mrs. Henderson. The story came out in fragments. Her husband's death, her months in the wilderness, her desperate flight from Thornfield's men. Henderson listened with growing outrage, her face darkening as Laura described the crimes that had destroyed her life. "I knew Thomas Smith," Mrs. Henderson said when Laura finished. "Good man, honest as the day is long. He surveyed my late husband's claim, wouldn't take a penny more than his fee even though the work took twice as long as expected." "Then you know he wouldn't have lied about what he found," Laura said. "Course not, but proving it's another matter entirely. Thornfield's got half the territorial government in his pocket, and the other half's too scared to cross him." Henderson's words confirmed what Laura had already begun to suspect. Even with the evidence Thomas had gathered, even with witnesses who could testify to his character, the legal system was too corrupted to deliver justice. The realization was both liberating and terrifying. If the law could not help her, then she would have to find another way. She met Daniel at the town's small hotel where he had secured them separate rooms under assumed names. The desk clerk, a nervous man who kept glancing toward the street as if expecting trouble, seemed relieved when Daniel paid in gold rather than asking questions. "Learn anything useful?" Daniel asked as they sat in the hotel's modest dining room. Laura told him about her conversation with Mrs. Henderson and about the growing conviction that legal justice was impossible. "Put it out." Daniel nodded grimly. That night, as Laura lay in a real bed for the second time in months, she found herself thinking about the man she had become. 3 months ago, she had been a homesteader's wife, someone who believed in law and order, in the basic goodness of civilization. Now she was contemplating actions that would have horrified her former self. But she was not the same woman who had fled into the mountains. The wilderness had changed her, had burned away everything soft and naive, and left something harder in its place. She was still Laura Smith, still Thomas's widow, but she was also something new, something dangerous. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Mrs. Henderson arrived at the hotel before dawn, her face pale with fear and excitement. She whispered urgently. Laura felt ice form in her stomach. "But I thought we could do some." Daniel said, already moving toward their gear. But Mrs. Henderson shook her head. Quote 96, Daniel's expression was grim but not defeated. "Then maybe it's time to stop running." The abandoned mine shaft lay 3 miles outside Millfield, hidden in a fold of hills that had been played out years before. Daniel led Laura through the pre-dawn darkness with the sure-footed confidence of a man who had scouted this route carefully. Behind them, the lights of the town flickered like distant stars, and somewhere among those lights, Marcus Thornfield was organizing the hunt that would end with either Laura's capture or his own destruction. Quote 98, Daniel said as they reached the mine entrance. Laura examined the terrain with eyes that had learned to see tactical advantages during her months in the wilderness. The mine entrance was positioned halfway up a steep slope, with clear fields of fire in all directions. Anyone approaching would be exposed and vulnerable, while defenders could retreat deeper into the mine if necessary. Quote, "Hunt," she said. It was not a question. Quote, "101," Daniel replied. Quote, "1. They spent the morning preparing their position, using the mining equipment left behind by the previous operators to create obstacles in defensive positions. Daniel's years of military service, a part of his past he rarely discussed, became evident in the thoroughness of his preparations. Served in the war, he explained when Laura commented on his expertise, learned a few things about making a small force count against larger numbers. As the sun climbed higher, they could see dust clouds rising from the direction of Millfield. Thornfield had discovered their trail and was bringing his men to finish what he had started months ago. Laura felt a strange calm settle over her as she watched the approaching riders. After so many months of running, of living in constant fear, there was almost a relief in knowing that the chase was finally ending. "You could still leave," she told Daniel. "This is my fight, my husband's justice to claim." Daniel checked his rifle one final time, his movements precise and economical. "Catherine would never forgive me if I walked away now. Besides, some debts can only be paid in full." The first of Thornfield's men appeared on the trail below just after noon. Laura counted 12 riders, all armed and moving with the confidence of men who believed victory was assured. At their head rode Marcus Thornfield himself, his expensive clothes and polished boots marking him as a man who preferred others to do his killing for him. Daniel had positioned himself at the mine entrance, while Laura took cover behind a pile of mining equipment that offered both protection and a clear view of the approaching riders. The evidence that had cost Thomas his life lay between them, wrapped in oilcloth and weighted with stones. If they died here, at least the truth would survive to be found by others. Thornfield called a halt when his men reached the base of the slope. Even at this distance, Laura could see the calculation in his eyes as he studied their position. He was a careful man, not given to unnecessary risks. He would try negotiation first, threats second, and violence only as a last resort. Quote 108, his voice carried clearly in the thin mountain air. Quote 109, Laura almost laughed at the absurdity of the offer. Quote 110, quote 111. Thornfield replied, his mask of civility beginning to slip. Quote 101, quote 113, Laura called back. Quote 114, Thornfield's patience was clearly wearing thin. "You have something that belongs to me, return it, and perhaps we can reach an accommodation." "The only thing I have is the truth," Laura said, "and that's something you can't buy or steal or burn." The negotiation, such as it was, continued for several more minutes. Thornfield offered bribes, made threats, and finally resorted to crude intimidation. Through it all, Laura felt her resolve hardening. This man had destroyed everything she held dear, had murdered her husband and countless others in his quest for wealth and power. Today, finally, he would face the consequences of his actions. Daniel had remained silent throughout the exchange, but Laura could sense his growing tension. He was a man of action, not words, and the talking was wearing on him. When Thornfield finally lost patience and began ordering his men to advance, Daniel was ready. The first shot echoed across the mountainside like thunder. One of Thornfield's men tumbled from his saddle, clutching a shoulder that bloomed red with blood. The others scattered, seeking cover among the rocks and scrub brush that dotted the slope. Quote 108, Daniel muttered, working the bolt of his rifle. Quote 109, the battle for the mine was brief but vicious. Thornfield's men were experienced gunfighters, but they were fighting uphill against opponents who knew the terrain intimately and had nothing left to lose. Daniel's military training showed in every carefully placed shot, while Laura surprised herself with her own deadly accuracy. The months in the wilderness had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. Where once she would have hesitated to take a human life, now she fired without mercy at men who had come to murder her. The gentle homesteader's wife was gone, replaced by someone harder and more dangerous. 3 of Thornfield's men fell in the first exchange of gunfire. The others took cover and began a more cautious advance, using the natural features of the landscape to mask their movement. But Daniel had anticipated this, had prepared for exactly this type of assault. He said, pointing toward a cluster of boulders where movement was barely visible. Quote 121. Laura adjusted her position and waited. When the men broke cover to rush the next position, her rifle spoke twice in rapid succession. Both attackers stumbled and fell, their advance broken before it could truly begin. The pattern continued for the better part of an hour. Thornfield's men would probe for weaknesses, only to be driven back by accurate fire from the mine entrance. But Laura knew that time was not on their side. They had limited ammunition, and Thornfield could afford to wait for reinforcements from town. "We need to end this quickly," she told Daniel during a brief lull in the fighting. "Agreed," he replied, but Thornfield's staying well back, letting his men take the risks. "We need to draw him out." The solution, when it came, was as dangerous as it was simple. Laura would expose herself, would give Thornfield a target too tempting to resist. When he moved to take the shot personally, Daniel would be waiting. Too risky, Daniel protested when she outlined the plan. If I miss, if my timing's off by even a second, then I die, Laura said simply. But if we do nothing, we all die anyway. At least this way we have a chance to take him with us. Daniel's face was grim, but he could not argue with her logic. They were outnumbered and outgunned, fighting a delaying action against an enemy with superior resources. Bold action was their only hope of victory. Laura made her way to a position that would give Thornfield a clear shot while still offering her some protection. She could see him below, crouched behind a wagon his men had overturned for cover. His expensive rifle glinted in the afternoon sun as he studied the mine entrance, looking for exactly the opportunity she was about to provide. She stepped into the open, making herself visible for just long enough to draw his attention. Thornfield's reaction was immediate and predictable. He raised his rifle, took a careful aim, and prepared to end the hunt that had consumed so much of his time and resources. Daniel's shot took him in the chest just as his finger tightened on the trigger. Thornfield's rifle discharged harmlessly into the ground as he toppled backward, his expensive clothes already darkening with blood. The man who had terrorized the territory for years lay dying in the dirt, finally brought to account for his crimes. The effect on his men was immediate and dramatic. Without their leader's money and authority to motivate them, they lost the will to continue the fight. Some fled immediately, spurring their horses down the mountain trail. Others threw down their weapons and called for mercy. Laura emerged from cover slowly, her rifle still ready but no longer needed. The battle was over, and somehow, impossibly, they had won. Justice had finally been served, not by courts and lawyers, but by the harsh laws of the mountain frontier. Daniel approached Thornfield's still form and knelt beside him. The man was still breathing, but barely. His eyes were wide with shock and pain, and perhaps with the realization that his long run of luck had finally ended. Should have left her alone, Daniel said quietly. Should have been content with what you already stole. Thornfield tried to speak, but only blood emerged from his lips. His eyes found Laura, and in them she saw not remorse or regret, but only a bitter anger that his plans had been thwarted. He died as he had lived, without honor or redemption. Laura stood over the body of her husband's killer and felt not triumph, but a profound weariness. The quest for justice was over, but the victory felt hollow. Thomas was still dead, their dreams still ashes. Nothing they had done here could change that fundamental reality. Quote 131. Daniel said, rising from beside Thornfield's body. Yes, Laura agreed. It's finished. The aftermath of the battle brought unexpected complications. Word of Thornfield's death spread quickly through the territory, carried by the surviving members of his gang and by witnesses from Millfield who had heard the gunfire. The reaction was mixed. Relief from those who had suffered under his depredations, concern from officials who had profited from his corruption. Laura and Daniel found themselves in the strange position of being both heroes and fugitives. The territorial governor, faced with the evidence of Thornfield's crimes that Laura had preserved, was forced to acknowledge the justice of their actions. But he was also concerned about the precedent set by citizens taking the law into their own hands. There will have to be an inquiry, he explained during their meeting in the territorial capital. Questions about the use of force, the circumstances of Thornfield's death, political considerations. Laura listened to his carefully worded warnings with growing impatience. Even in death, Thornfield's influence lingered, his corruption so deep that even clear evidence of his crimes could not guarantee justice for his victims. Quote, 136, and she said finally. Quote, 137, Sin. The governor was an honest man caught in an impossible situation. Quote, 138. Daniel spoke for the first time since entering the governor's office. Let them come. We'll be ready. But Laura was thinking beyond immediate threats to the larger question of what came next. Thornfield was dead, his organization scattered, but the conditions that had allowed him to flourish remained unchanged. Corrupt officials still held office, fraudulent land claims still needed to be addressed, and other predators would inevitably move to fill the void he had left. The evidence we've provided, she said, what will happen to it? The governor gestured toward the stack of documents on his desk. It will be used to prosecute Thornfield's associates, to invalidate fraudulent claims, to restore stolen property to its rightful owners. Your husband's work will not be in vain." It was something, Laura supposed. Not the complete justice Thomas had envisioned, but a beginning. The corruption would take years to fully root out, and there would be setbacks and compromises along the way. But the truth was finally in the light, and that was more than she had dared hope for during those dark months in the mountains. The inquiry, when it came, was largely a formality. Too many people had suffered under Thornfield's rule for there to be much sympathy for his fate. The official verdict was justifiable homicide in defense of life and property, a finding that surprised no one who knew the facts of the case. Laura and Daniel were free to go, to rebuild their lives as they saw fit. But freedom, Laura discovered, was not the same thing as peace. The months of flight and hardship had changed her in ways that could not be easily undone. She was no longer the woman who had fled into the mountains, and she could never again be the person she had been before Thomas's death. Daniel understood her struggle, perhaps better than anyone else could. He had faced the same choice years before, had wrestled with the same questions about identity and purpose in the aftermath of loss. His solution had been retreat, withdrawal to the sanctuary of the high peaks. But Laura was not built for such isolation. "What will you do now?" he asked as they prepared to leave the territorial capital. "I don't know," Laura admitted. "I can't go back to the way things were. That woman, that life, it's gone forever. But I don't know what comes next." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face thoughtful. "Could start over," he said finally. "New place, new life. The territory's growing. Always need folks willing to work hard and stand up for what's right." Together. The question slipped out before Laura could stop it, surprising them both with its directness. Daniel met her eyes, and in them she saw the same uncertainty she felt. They had been through so much together, had shared dangers and hardships that had forged bonds deeper than mere friendship. But they were also two damaged people, scarred by loss and shaped by violence. Whether they could build something positive from such foundations remained to be seen. "If you'll have me," Daniel said simply, "I'm not much for pretty words or fancy promises, but I'll stand by you, whatever comes. That's something I can offer." Laura considered his words and the man who spoke them. Daniel Hall was not Thomas, could never replace the gentle scholar she had loved and lost. But he was something else, something perhaps more suited to the harsh realities of frontier life. He was a man who understood that sometimes justice required violence, that survival demanded strength, that love was not just emotion, but commitment forged in fire. The small valley Daniel had chosen for their new beginning lay 50 miles north of the territorial capital, far enough from civilization to offer privacy, but close enough to reach help if needed. It was beautiful country, with clear streams and fertile soil, surrounded by mountains that offered both protection and isolation. They built their cabin together, working through the summer and into the fall to create something that was truly theirs. Laura found unexpected satisfaction in the physical labor, in the simple act of creating shelter and security with her own hands. The work was hard, but it was also healing, a way of rebuilding not just a home, but a life. Daniel proved to be a patient teacher, sharing the skills he had learned during his years alone in the mountains. He showed Laura how to read weather signs, how to preserve meat for the winter months, how to find water in seemingly barren terrain. More importantly, he taught her to trust herself, to rely on her own judgment and capabilities. "You're stronger than you know," he told her one evening as they sat by their fire, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Stronger than you were when this all started, stronger than you think you are now." Laura considered his words, thinking about the journey that had brought her to this place. 6 months ago, she had been a frightened woman fleeing through the wilderness, dependent on others for survival. Now she was building a new life with her own hands, making decisions about her own future. "I feel different," she admitted. "Like I'm becoming someone I never thought I could be." "You're becoming who you always were," Daniel said. "The mountains just burned away everything that wasn't essential." As winter approached, they faced a decision that would define the nature of their relationship. They could continue as partners, friends bound by shared experience and mutual respect. Or they could become something more, could build the kind of life together that both had lost to Marcus Thornfield's greed. The choice was complicated by their respective histories. Laura was still mourning Thomas, still processing the grief and anger that had driven her through the mountains. Daniel carried his own scars, his own memories of love lost and chances missed. Neither wanted to diminish what they had shared with their previous partners, but neither wanted to be trapped forever by the past. The conversation, when it finally came, was awkward and halting. Both had grown accustomed to expressing themselves through actions rather than words, and the emotional territory they were exploring was unfamiliar ground. Quote 157. Laura said as they worked together to prepare the cabin for winter. Quote 158. Daniel nodded, understanding the complexity of her feelings. Quote 159. Quote 160. Quote 161. They were married in the spring in a simple ceremony performed by a traveling preacher who happened to be passing through their valley. There were no guests, no celebration, just two people making a commitment to face whatever came next together. The marriage was different from what either had known before. It was built not on youthful passion or romantic idealism, but on mature understanding of life's hardships and the value of true partnership. They had seen each other at their worst, had shared danger and desperation and loss. What they built together was stronger for having been tested by fire. Laura found that she could love Daniel without betraying Thomas's memory, just as Daniel could care for her without dishonoring Catherine. They were different people now, shaped by experience and loss into something harder, but also more resilient. Their love was not the gentle affection of youth, but the deep partnership of survivors who had chosen to face the future together. The valley they had claimed began to attract other settlers, people drawn by the promise of good land and honest neighbors. Laura and Daniel became leaders in the small community that grew up around their homestead, their reputation for fairness and courage making them natural arbiters of disputes and organizers of collective efforts. Laura discovered that she had a talent for teaching, for passing on the skills and knowledge she had acquired during her months in the wilderness. She helped other women adapt to frontier life, shared the hard-won wisdom that had kept her alive when everything seemed hopeless. Daniel used his military experience to organize the community's defenses, training the men and women who had chosen to make their lives in this remote valley. The territory was still dangerous, still home to outlaws and hostile forces, but their little settlement was prepared to defend itself. Years passed, and the valley prospered. What had begun as a handful of isolated homesteads grew into a thriving community with its own school, church, and general store. Laura and Daniel's cabin became the center of a small town that bore their name, a testament to what could be accomplished when good people work together toward common goals. Laura never had children of her own, a source of sorrow that she carried quietly but did not allow to define her life. Instead, she became a mother figure to the many children in their community, teaching them to read and write, sharing stories of courage and perseverance, helping them understand that strength came not from avoiding hardship, but from facing it with dignity and determination. Totalis one sikpamus. Tupam, she had once cried to Daniel in a moment of despair, believing that her inability to bear children made her somehow less worthy of love and partnership. Daniel's response had been characteristic in its simplicity and wisdom. "Then we'll just love us," he had said, holding her close as she wept for the children she would never have. "Love each other, love this place, love the life we're building together. That's enough. That's more than enough." And it was. Their love became a foundation not just for their own happiness, but for the entire community that grew up around them. They showed by example that families could be built in many ways, that children could be nurtured and guided without sharing blood, that love was about commitment and care rather than biology. The evidence that had cost Thomas his life eventually led to the prosecution of dozens of Thornfield's associates. Fraudulent land claims were invalidated, stolen property was returned to its rightful owners, and the territorial government underwent reforms that made such widespread corruption more difficult in the future. It was not perfect justice, but it was progress, and Thomas's sacrifice had not been in vain. Laura kept his memory alive in other ways as well. She established a library in the town that bore her and Daniel's name, filling it with books that celebrated learning and truth and justice. A plaque by the entrance honored Thomas Smith, the surveyor who had died fighting corruption, whose courage had inspired others to continue the struggle for honest government. Daniel found his own form of redemption in the life they built together. The angry, bitter man who had retreated to the mountains after losing everything gradually gave way to someone who could find joy in simple pleasures, who could laugh with children and dance with his wife and take pride in the community they had helped create. He never forgot Catherine, never stopped mourning the life they had planned together. But he learned to carry that grief without being crushed by it, to honor her memory by living fully rather than merely existing. Laura's love had not replaced what he had lost, but it had shown him that the human heart was large enough to hold both sorrow and joy, both memory and hope. As Laura grew older, she often thought about the woman she had been before Thomas's death, before the flight through the mountains, before the battle that had ended Marcus Thornfield's reign of terror. That woman seemed like a stranger now, someone soft and naive who had believed that the world was fundamentally just and that good would always triumph over evil. She knew better now. She understood that justice was something that had to be fought for, that evil was a constant presence that required constant vigilance to contain. But she also knew that the fight was worth it, that even in a harsh and dangerous world, love and courage and determination could create pockets of light and warmth and hope. The valley they had claimed and tamed became such a place. It was not perfect, was still subject to the hardships and uncertainties that defined frontier life. But it was good, was filled with people who looked out for each other, who stood together against threats, who understood that community was not just about proximity, but about shared values and mutual commitment. Laura and Daniel grew old together in that valley, surrounded by the town they had helped build and the people they had helped shape. They faced the challenges that came with age, with the same partnership that had carried them through younger trials, supporting each other through illness and loss, celebrating together the achievements of their adopted children and grandchildren. When Daniel died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 73, Laura mourned him as deeply as she had mourned Thomas. But she did not break, did not retreat into bitterness or despair. She continued to live, to teach, to contribute to the community they had built together, carrying on their shared work until her own peaceful death 5 years later. They were buried side by side in the cemetery overlooking the town that bore their name, their graves marked by simple stones that recorded their names and dates but said nothing of the extraordinary journey that had brought them together. The real monument to their lives was the community itself, the values they had instilled, the example they had set for future generations. The story of Laura Smith and Daniel Hall became legend in the territory, passed down through generations as an example of courage in the face of adversity, of love found in the aftermath of loss, of justice achieved through determination and sacrifice. It was a story that reminded people that even in the darkest times, even when all seemed lost, hope could be found in the simple act of refusing to surrender, of choosing to fight for what was right regardless of the cost. And in the end, that was perhaps the greatest victory of all. Not just that evil had been defeated, but that good had been allowed to flourish, that love had triumphed over hate, that two broken people had found a way to heal each other, and in doing so, had healed an entire community. It was a legacy worthy of the price that had been paid for it, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit to overcome any obstacle, to find light in any darkness, to create beauty and meaning even in the harshest of circumstances.